Okay, now that we've finished the deep dive, I'll discuss a few more topics related to Milankovitch cycles. Of course, Milankovitch was not the first to propose that paleoclimate changes were a result of changes to the Earth's orbital conditions. First person to do that was James Croll, who was a British scientist, and he proposed this in the 1800s. And based on some of the calculations of the Earth's orbital changes, he proposed that eccentricity would be the strongest control on climate changes. And the reason he said this was that because he thought that because of the changes on how close the Earth was to the sun, that it would change the strength of the Gulf Stream, and that each side of the Earth would, or each hemisphere of the Earth would change the strength of the current going from the equator to the pole. So right now we're in a situation where the Gulf Stream is quite strong, and he assumed that when the Earth's orbit was such that the southern hemisphere was closer to the sun, that would change the current so that it went southwards. And as a result, he also proposed that the glaciations would be asynchronous between the northern and southern hemispheres. And this idea was not accepted by a lot of scientists, but one scientist who thought it was a great idea was Charles Darwin in the origin and in the Origin of Species. He talks about this. So Charles Darwin in the Voyage of the Beagle did a lot of work in South America, and he did a lot of observations on the glacial geology in Patagonia, and he noted that while there was an ice age in Patagonia, and there was an ice sheet similar to what there was in Europe and North America, and he also was looking at how the tundra species, like the plants and animals, are quite similar in Patagonia as they were in Europe. So he thought this was a great idea, this orbital theory by Kroll, and you know, I'll read you the paragraph that he wrote about it, and he's like, from these several facts, namely from the glacial action having extended all round the northern and southern hemispheres, from the period having been in a geological sense recent in both hemispheres, having its lasted in both during and a great length of time, as may be inferred from the amount of work effected, and lastly from glaciers having recently descended to a low level along the whole line of the Cordillera, it at one time appeared to me that it could not avoid the conclusion that the temperature of the whole world had been simultaneously lowered during the glacial period. But now Mr. Kroll, in a series of admirable memoirs, has attempted to show that a glacial condition of climate is the result of various physical causes brought into operation by an increase in the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. All these causes tend towards the same end, but the most powerful appears to be the indirect influence of the eccentricity of the orbit upon ocean currents. According to Mr. Kroll, cold periods regularly occur every 10 or 15,000 years, and these at long intervals are extremely severe, owing to certain contingencies, of which the most important, as Sir Charles Lyell has shown, in the relative position of the land and water. Mr. Kroll believes that the last great glacial period occurred about 240,000 years ago, and endured with slight alterations of climate for about 160,000 years. With respect to the more ancient glacial periods, several geologists are convinced from direct evidence that such occurred during the Miocene and Eocene formations, not to mention still more ancient formations. But the more important result for us, arrived at by Mr. Croll, is that whenever the northern hemisphere passes through a cold period, the temperature of the southern hemisphere is actually raised, with the winters rendered much milder, chiefly through changes in the direction of the ocean currents. So conversely, it will be with the northern hemisphere, whilst the southern passes through a glacial period. This conclusion throws so much light on geographical distribution that I'm strongly inclined to trust it. But I will first give the facts which demanded an explanation. So Charles Darwin really liked this idea because it explained some of the distribution of species, which he described in The Origin of Species. However, there were problems with Croll's idea, and the main problem is that Croll proposed that the last ice age ended over 100,000 years ago, and the issue was that even by the relatively crude dating methods they had for geology in the 19th century, this was too long of a period. As an example, Niagara Falls, the erosion rate of Niagara Falls was fairly well established, and they said, well, if the ice age ended that long ago, Niagara Falls would not be there because it would have eroded back to Lake Erie. And anyway, it was also very clear that there was the northern and southern hemisphere glaciations probably happened at the same time. And the main thing that really discredited Croll's ideas was the hypothesis by Svante Arrhenius in 1896 that the climate changes could be explained by changes in carbon dioxide, and he provided a detailed calculation of that. So, when Milankovitch came back in the 1910s and 1920s and said, no, look, the orbital variations are what's causing these interglacial cycles, it met with a lot of resistance because this carbon dioxide proposal by Arrhenius seemed to work quite well. And anyway, it wasn't until the 1960s that we started to get these oxygen isotope proxy records from the ocean that we were able to confirm that Milankovitch theory was actually the main control on glacial and interglacial cycles. The second reason we know that Milankovitch theory actually works is that the Earth is not the only place that is affected by Milankovitch cycles. So Mars also has changes in climate due to changes in the orbit. So right now, Mars you can see it has ice caps on the North Pole and the South Polar regions. But Mars had an ice age, and it actually has ice ages in the opposite sense of the Earth. So when Mars's obliquity angle is much higher, then that will cause these polar ice caps to melt, and that will cause the ice to go to a more equatorial region. And Mars has much larger variations in obliquity than the Earth. And in the past 10 million years, it's been calculated that it has varied between 14 and 48 degrees, which is compared to Earth's 22 to 24 degrees. It's a lot larger, and it's kind of erratic. So obliquity is kind of a chaotic feature. So basically, up until about 5 million years ago, Mars was in this regime where the obliquity varied between about 25 and 48 degrees. But in the past 5 million years, it sort of abruptly changed and went down to between 15 and 35 degrees. And this step change, it's interesting because it's a consequence of general relativity, and it serves as one of the proofs that general relativity is affecting orbital motions. And anyway, if you look at the surface of Mars, there's evidence that there were glaciers, and we know these are geologically recent because most of Mars is covered with craters from meteor impacts, but these glacial features, or these features that look like glacial features, don't really have any craters on them. And if you look at it, it looks very much like what it looks like if a glacier melts on the Earth. You'll find like a ridge towards the bottom of where the glacier was, where there's an accumulation of sediment. And there was a paper written by Head et al., and they proposed, based on the obliquity of Mars, that the most recent Martian ice age may have ended as recently as 400,000 years ago. And it's pretty amazing to think about that the surface of Mars, which, years ago they thought that Mars was kind of a dead planet, but there's actually geomorphology, active geomorphology impacting Mars in the same way as Earth in terms of glaciation. So yeah, Milankovitch's theory, it works not just on Earth, but it also works on Mars. So maybe someday in the future we'll be able to go to Mars and take samples and date when this glaciation happened, which is possible using cosmogenic isotopes. Something I'll talk about in a future episode. All right.